Center. My name is Jeff DeBelko. I have the good fortune of directing our environmental change and security program and coordinating our global health initiative, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome back many friends of the center who've been grappling with these political demography questions from a variety of angles for many years, and we have felt very fortunate to be a place that they have kindly come to share their thoughts with the audiences that we tried to assemble here at the center, one that mixes the scholar and the practitioner, directly reflecting Wilson's legacy as our only president to have a PhD, and in fact was exactly what Congress had in mind in 1968 when they set up the center as a nonpartisan, non-advocacy forum for bringing these two worlds together. Our environmental change and security program is a little younger than that. We've been around since 1994, and questions of political demography or security, or however we're framing it, have been a long-time interest of ours. One that at times we have felt like we are relatively lonely in the field. We hope today we can discuss some of the challenges of topics that cross disciplines and various topic areas where they find a home, or how difficult it is at times to find a home, whether it's in a journal or in a government office or a political discussion space. But we have been very keen to try to provide a forum where these issues can be discussed, because as you will hear, they are diverse, they are dynamic, they are challenging, and they are, I think, quite critical in the policy context that we're often talking about from a variety of different angles, as you will hear, in a variety of different places and settings, in ways expected and in many ways unexpected. And so part of what has been very valuable is that, as opposed to a number of meetings in Washington where you probably know most of what you hear, we actually learn things in these discussions, because it's not all the intuitive, above-the-fold headline stories that we'll hear from. This session, like so many that our program has, is generously supported by USAID and our Office of Population and Reproductive Health under our HELPS program. That's Health, Environment, Livelihoods, Population, and Security. It's intentionally all those things together to try to facilitate these discussions across the topics. We're going to kick off what is really a book launch, a book that we have talked for quite a while with Jack Goldstone, one of the editors. Jack has kept us up to date on the progress of this book, and we kind of had a standing invitation that when it was finished that we'd like to get together as we are today to discuss it. But it's entitled Political Demography, Identity, Institutions, and Conflict, which gives some breadth and depth to this diverse topic. Jack is going to kick us off with a discussion that paints the broad picture and puts this in context, connects some of these different dynamics together. We'll have a Q&A, and then we'll have two kind of successive, we won't quite call them panels, but we'll do a couple pairs with Mark Haas, who's here, Associate Professor, Political Science Department at Duquesne, with Eric Kaufman, who's a Professor of Politics at Birkbeck College, the University of London, Elizabeth Leahy Madsen, who's now at the Futures Group, and all of whom are contributors to the book. We have to, unfortunately, send apologies. Henrik Erdahl has come down with a flu and was not able to make the transatlantic flight, and Monica Duffy-Toft, whom we also had hoped to have here, had a conflict that she just couldn't get out of at the last minute. But we will be able to continue to engage them as well as others whom we've worked closely with, who are contributors, Jennifer Shuba from Rhodes, Richard Sincata from Stimson. And so we look forward to this rich conversation with folks we have here and others whom we know will be back. So Jack, I'm going to turn the floor over to you. I think many of you know Jack is the Virginia E. and John T. Hazel Jr. Professor at George Mason School of Public Policy. He is really a go-to person on these topics. I have learned so much from Jack in a variety of forums, whether it was the State Failure Task Force or whether it was discussions on revolutions or political demography or environment conflict. He has been a contributor here at the center in a variety of forums, and so it's always terrific to welcome him back. And so, Jack, please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Jeff. And everyone who contributed to this volume owes a debt of thanks to you and to the Woodrow Wilson Center, and particularly the Environmental Conflict Group, because you were one of the first institutions and one of the first individuals to embrace what we were doing as important. And nowadays, you can't pick up a newspaper or a magazine without seeing an article on the youth bulge in the Middle East, or aging in China, or some other demographic issue. It's become very widespread. But I think the foundation for this was laid some years ago, in part through what you were doing here at the center. So my thanks to that. The book has been gestating for a while, as Jeff said, and we actually changed the subtitle before publication because the publisher said, institution's identity, that's nice, but what does the book really talk about? And so the new subtitle, I think, is more descriptive. It's How Population Changes Are Reshaping International Security and National Politics. And that's really what it's about, because the shifts in global population now are having a broad impact on our security, security of Europe, security of China, Iran, parts of Africa, Latin America. The world's population is changing in ways that are historically unprecedented, and these will certainly change the security posture of all major regions. Similarly, populations are shifting within national borders as well as across, and that has implications for national politics, both in the United States and abroad. Now, the book assembles kind of an all-star cast of experts on regional, international, and local change. I'll briefly go through some of what's covered in here so you have an idea of how valuable we think this is. But we're hoping this will be kind of a landmark book because it's the first one to really ask, what are the political consequences of population changes? Not just of aging, not just of youth, but let's look at all the demographic shifts that are taking place around the world today, and let's consider the full range of outcomes, particularly when you consider them acting together interactively. We hope this book will be widely used by people as an introduction to the field. There's a little primer there in demography in the beginning, so if you want to know more about fertility rates, what does it mean when fertility falls below replacement, how do demographers operate and make their forecasts, there's a very straightforward introduction to those topics in the first couple of chapters. But beyond that, the book really tries to cover the major consequences of population change. As you all know, population change has huge consequences for the environment through climate change, energy use, resource use, and waste. It has huge consequences for public health. On those, the public health and energy communities have been prolific. But we think there's been a relative neglect of the political consequences of population change, and that's why we wanted to come together and present our work as this volume. Now, the work is divided into four basic topics. One is population and international security. The big issue here is that the main powers that have guided global politics since World War II, that is the NATO alliance and Russia and China, are no longer as dominant as they were, not economically, not demographically. Yes, the U.S. still has by far the world's largest military. Yes, Europe, the European Union, plus Russia, Ukraine, that's the world's largest single industrial society, if you take them as a unity, which is very much in question at the moment, I realize. And of course, China's the largest country in the world by population. But all of these things are changing very dramatically. China's population growth, due to the one-child policy, is slowing down. Indeed, the growth of China's labor force will stop within the next few years. And it will plummet remarkably. China is actually, on current projections, likely to have its youth population, the youngsters 15 to 24, drop by 75 million people by 2040. It's quite astonishing what the one-child policy will do now that we've seen it in operation for several decades. So China's going to be adjusting to a shrinking workforce and a rapidly aging population. Europe, of course, similarly, an aging population facing very prominent agreements to provide generous pension support, and also a military that has shifted to a professional voluntary model at a time when the number of families with young children, and particularly the number of families with more than one child, is dropping very, very sharply. And indeed, part of the security problem for Britain and the rest of Europe is guns and butters, the way it's classically put, even more so for some of the smaller NATO countries. Their population's aging so fast that the commitment to providing pensions and health care for an aging population is going to be a major drain on government revenues. And the ability to continue to support a very expensive, high-tech, capital-intensive model of military activity is going to be ever more difficult. Now, it's certainly true that the military revolution is trying to replace boots on the ground with unarmed drones, but as we've seen, when we're talking about delivering humanitarian aid, when we're talking about trying to reduce sectarian conflict, when we're talking about asymmetric warfare, there's unfortunately no substitute for peacekeeping forces on the ground, and providing them is going to become ever more expensive and difficult for a Europe that is aging. Mark Haas, our expert on this issue, is going to talk later today on that particular topic. Second major issue, though, is that the forces for internal conflict and instability in many developing countries will continue to grow as they face large youthful populations that are continuing to grow rapidly. Now, how fast and how far they'll grow, of course, is a demographic guessing game. There are several ways to approach demographic forecasts. One way, of course, is to simply extend past behavior into the future. But that seems not a reliable guide. We have been surprised by how fast fertility has fallen in some developing countries, such as Brazil. We've also been surprised by how little fertility has fallen after some initial drops in countries like Nigeria and Ethiopia. What we're seeing is a huge variety of demographic trajectories around the world. The general pattern we think we understand pretty well. As countries grow richer and more urban, people prefer a smaller family size. As women become more educated and enter the labor market in larger numbers, their childbearing years shrink and they have fewer children. So this demographic transition from a pre-industrial situation of high birth rates and high death rates to what we call a modern condition of relatively low birth rates and low death rates seems to be underway everywhere in the world. But what we don't know is how long that transition will take in a given country. Some countries, like Iran, have accomplished this with enormous speed. Iran essentially went through the demographic transition in a couple of decades. West European countries, who started much earlier, took 80 to 100 years to stabilize from relatively high birth and death rates to low birth and death rates. We had thought that many countries in Africa and South Asia would also make this relatively quickly, but many of them seem to have stalled. And what's more, they've stalled at a point where death rates have fallen markedly and continue to fall due to improvements in maternal health care and infant care, but birth rates, for cultural or other reasons, do not seem to have fallen as rapidly or have leveled off at still relatively high rates of 3, 4, 5 births per family. The result is that some countries are still growing extremely rapidly. Afghanistan, for example, despite the conflict, is projected to triple its population by the end of this century. The latest United Nations forecast presented earlier this year projects Nigeria's population to continue to grow throughout this century. And in fact, the target they put on it is, to me, the highly unrealistic level of 750 million Nigerians by 2100. This would require remarkable improvements in the ability of Nigeria's territory to support its population, so I think it's unlikely. But it does suggest that in some areas of the world, we are not seeing the rapid fall in fertility that we would expect. And as I'll talk about a little bit later today, one of the major concerns we have in terms of political consequences is that those countries that still have the most rapidly growing and youthful populations coincide all too often with those countries that have relatively weak governments, that are not managing the economies very effectively, and that do not manage internal conflicts very effectively. A youth bulge and a demographic transition can be a great opportunity for economic growth and socialization. A youth cohort that is more educated than its parents will be more productive. A youth cohort that is innovative promises to extend the frontiers of technological advance. But a youth cohort that is either not effectively educated for marketable employment or not effectively socialized and integrated into mainstream political and social life is a youth cohort that tends to be frustrated and seeking other outlets. And those other outlets often are in politically or religiously radical communities. And we are seeing, as I will show later on somewhat graphically, we're seeing a general decline in conflict around the world that has corresponded very closely with the general aging of world population. But there are regions where that general trend is not holding and where we have real concerns that not properly educating and integrating youth populations will lead to scenes of conflict. There's been a lot of talk about the role of youth in North Africa and the revolutions in the Arab world, and we'll talk about that a little more later this afternoon. Third area that the book deals with is changes in national politics, first in Europe and the United States. And here there are a couple dimensions to it. In Europe, a lot of the concern is about the changing composition of European societies. As they are aging, will the gap in the labor force be filled with migration? And if so, from where? Will migrants come from within Europe, from Eastern Europe, from Central Asia? Will they increasingly come from Africa? Will they come from Asia? And how will they fit into European societies? How will they change the politics of those societies? In America, immigration has been an ongoing political debate. We had outbursts in Arizona and Alabama this year over state laws. There's still concern about whether it makes sense to build a fence along our southern border. And one of the issues, I'm sure, in the presidential election to come will be, has this candidate or that candidate done enough, been firm enough, had a tough enough approach to immigration? Oddly, immigration is not something that you can easily turn on or off. The drivers of global immigration often tend to be beyond political control. For example, the number of migrants apprehended crossing the Mexican border has dropped by 75% in just the last 5 years. That hasn't been because of tougher border control. It's mainly because America's economy has seen a collapse in the construction industry that was a major job provider for immigrants. So variations in the world economy, or for that matter, a climate disaster or the outburst of conflict, these can suddenly drive or stop the flows of population. But for the longer term, it seems almost certain that global migration movements will increase. This is partly because of aging in Europe and a slowdown in the growth of the native population in the United States, both of which will drive a demand for labor from immigrants. But I think we're going to see a new phase in global migration that involves a huge expansion in migration within the developing world. That's because the disparity in age, structure, and income that we took for granted, yes, rich countries tend to be richer but older, developing countries tend to be poorer but younger, that difference is now being reproduced within the emerging economies. Because of the recent and rapid decline in fertility in countries like Brazil, Mexico, Turkey, those countries are also going to have a slowdown or even a reduction in the number of young people entering their labor markets internally in the next 20 years. They also have done economically well enough that they look like high-income countries to many of the poorest populations in sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Central America, and South Asia. Those poorer countries are the ones with the real surging youth populations. So I think we're going to see a huge leap forward in migration from the very poorest developing countries to the middle-income developing nations that are now starting to resemble and converge upon some of the paths of Europe and North America. At the same time, we're also going to see a wave of increasingly well-educated people in India, China, Turkey, Brazil, Mexico, spread out across the world in search of opportunities. They'll be moving to financial centers in London, Tokyo, and New York, but they'll also be leading economic expansion for companies investing in the developing world. So globalization, which has hit hard in the areas of financial and goods and services interaction, will, I think, step up now in the movement of peoples around the world. Unfortunately, that also carries all of the problems of integrating diverse communities and diverse individuals in an increasingly wide array of countries. The book also looks at the impact of population change on our own politics here in the U.S. There's an excellent article by William Frey here at the Brookings Institution on how the changing demographics of America contributed to Obama's electoral victory, and on how immigration and shifting birth rates of different groups in the U.S. are liable to impact future politics. It's quite an interesting story because on the one hand, the growth of immigrant and immigrant-descended communities tends to provoke the right to be more active. Yet it's also the case that immigrant communities are concentrated in several pivotal swing states. And so the need to court those communities becomes an additional demand for electoral success. The last area that the book looks at in some detail is the impact of shifting demographics in religiously and ethnically divided countries. Some of these are in sub-Saharan Africa, where tribal affiliations, or Nigeria, religious and tribal affiliations, threaten to split the country. Another example is in the Middle East with Israel-Palestine creating a cauldron where the dynamics of rapidly growing populations of Arab Israelis, Palestinians, and Orthodox Jews are shaking up the political alignments and the voting blocs in Israel. And we'll hear more from that this afternoon from Eric Kaufman. And even in Europe, within countries like Austria and Britain, domestic politics are being affected in part by perceptions of what immigration and changing levels of religious and ethnic diversity mean for identity. What does it mean to be German or Austrian or British? What do you have to do to qualify? Is it a question of how you speak, what you've learned, where you were raised, how you present yourself, how many generations back does it matter under what circumstances you entered? There are debates about dual citizenship that are growing increasingly vigorous as more and more people grow and work in a different country from which they were born. So these are the range of issues that the book talks about. Forgive me, there are copies on sale outside at the and you'll definitely be the first in your neighborhood to acquire a copy because the paperback does not formally get released until summer. We persuaded the publisher to have paperbacks specially available for this presentation at the price of $36. If you go on Amazon, you can only order the hardcover at $100, institutional pricing. So please take advantage. If you'd like to get a hold of this book, grab it today, because otherwise it won't be available probably for another 5 or 6 months at this price. Now, as I've said, the news media have caught on to the importance of population issues. I've seen stories in Business Week about the global youth unemployment problem, The Economist leading off about the plunge in birth rates. People are concerned about what will happen with differential contraception of males, differential abortion of males and females in China and India, creating skewed sex ratios. All of these issues are now widespread in the press. So I encourage you to follow those up, but it's important to get the right data and to understand the fundamental relationships, social relationships and political relationships that are impacted by these population changes in order to see clearly into the future. Now, Jeff wants me to stop here and take some general questions about global politics and population, and I'm happy to do so. I simply want to reserve the right that if you have a question that bears particularly on the expertise of one of our other co-authors, I'm going to hand the microphone over to them and let them join me. Jeff?
Terrific. Thank you very much, Jack. Why don't we do that? Have some conversations on this big picture, as Jack has very kindly laid out the contents of the book under the same cover, having an ability to connect some of these issues as his introduction has illustrated. And then he will be the best judge of where we drill down now or where we wait and defer the question. I have colleagues who have microphones who just ask that you use that to pose the questions, and we will also feel free to put our upcoming speakers on the spot as well to assist Jack. We'll start over here, please, sir.
Thank you, David Smith. You've talked about labor market drivers of immigration. Have you considered climate and conflict drivers of immigration and their consequences to political matters?
The book itself doesn't have a chapter on climate and conflict as drivers of migration. The reason for that is we worry that climate issues, frankly, will impact precisely the same countries that are going to be most affected by political breakdowns and problems of youth. So in a sense, it makes our story more difficult to add that layer in, but you're certainly right to do so. In terms of conflict driving migration, we highlight a number of regions and countries that we think are likely to suffer both internal conflicts and in particular ethnic conflicts. What we've seen, and again, I'll talk about this a little bit more when I speak later this afternoon, there's been a decline in violence around the world. Steven Pinker did a nice book about that, and it's been a very good thing. But along with that, the mirror image, if you will, has been a huge increase in the number of displaced peoples. So we've done a better job protecting people from the violent consequences of social and political breakdown, but protecting them doesn't necessarily mean restoring their lives or restoring peace. It often means that they become internally displaced peoples or become international migrants. Now, a lot of what happens there depends on everything from European asylum policy. Sweden, for example, is one of the leaders in European countries with percentage Muslim population. It's about 8%, and that's because they've had a very generous asylum policy, particularly toward regions in Asia and Africa that have been affected by conflict. The number of displaced people, both internally and externally, is now estimated at about 40 million by the United Nations. That's a huge number. That's a good-sized country, and that shows no sign at the moment of tapering off. So our expectation is that conflict will certainly continue to be a major driver of global migration flows. They are almost always undesirable flows because the people who are leaving did not choose to leave, are not prepared to leave, and the places they're going are often chosen for safety or adjacency rather than economic opportunity. So they are much more difficult to assimilate and provide for than labor market migrants. As far as climate goes, everything that we have seen about areas most at risk, from water shortage, droughts, extreme weather, all of that is important. But the vital political intermediating factor is what's the capacity of a government to respond to a crisis. Is a government like Haiti and unable to provide very well for a population that is distressed, or is a government more like Japan and able to step in and provide people with shelters and support? So we'll get to this again later today, but the real risk, I think, leading to forced migrations is going to be countries that have fragile or weak or weakly competent governments that are going to be faced with surging populations and often also with extreme climatic conditions.
I'd just add as a quick note here, the UK government has just put out a new report looking up Migration and Global Environmental Change, Future Challenges and Opportunities, the government's Office for Science's Foresight Program. Richard Black, somebody who's on the migration side, led that up. I think they had a session at Brookings last month. I urge you to check out that report. 60 or so peer-reviewed papers, so a real kind of corpus that we can now start drawing upon. Please, sir, here, and then we'll go in the back.
Wait, the microphone will get to you in a second.
I'm Jim Piffner, George Mason University. Jack, would you say a little bit more about China's one-child policy and sex ratios, and is it large enough to make a difference politically or militarily?
There's a bit of a debate among China specialists about how many women are out there in China hidden from the census in order for families to have a male child. That is, a lot of rural families are suspected of having hidden the first birth if it was female, not registered it so that they could register a male birth. So the imbalance may not be as bad as the current statistics, which are more reliable for urban areas, suggest. Still, two things seem very clear. The one-child policy was effective enough in China to substantially reduce fertility, more that it drove it very quickly from the high levels that Mao had deliberately encouraged to a level of below replacement. Now, saying that the one-child policy brought China below replacement fertility shouldn't be taken as, oh, this drove China way off the curve of where a developing country would be. Because, in fact, Brazil is also below replacement fertility now, just as a consequence of economic choices made by the population. And Brazil, like China, is a large country with a still substantial rural population, but the desire of people for upward mobility seems to have driven a strong effort to use available contraception voluntarily to reduce family size. So the one-child policy affected China, but China is not a huge outlier. I would say the real issue in China from the one-child policy is because under Mao, policy was pronatal and then suddenly shifted. You didn't have a gradual decline. You had kind of a very sharp cliff-like decline in fertility. And this is going to produce a big overhang of aging population sooner than in other countries at similar levels of income. The buzzword about China is they will grow old before they get rich. Now, this is going to have substantial impact on China's economy, both because China's economy has been driven by almost unlimited access to literate, well-disciplined, low-wage labor. We are already seeing labor market scarcities in what previously had been some of the boom regions of China. Shanghai, Shenzhen, it's no longer easy to get all the low-wage labor you want. the one-child policy adopted 1980, the effects were deferred a little bit because so many of the young women born in the Mao years entered childbearing years themselves in the 1990s, and even with the low fertility, there were just so many of them that you still had a large birth cohort. But now as we move into 2020s, so that we're 2 generations into the one-child policy, we're really seeing the number of 15 to 30-year-olds in China fall very sharply after 2011, 2012. So this is going to impact their economy for certain. Will it impact their military? Probably not so much, because they're in the process of shifting from a more labor-intensive military to a capital-intensive military. They're trying to build up, as you know, their naval forces to protect their coast and sea routes. They're moving into more sophisticated missiles, aircraft carriers, and so on. I would say, to the extent that China's preoccupation is now how to extend its power beyond its immediate borders, rather than to protect its borders, the military manpower issue is less important for them. Particularly the case that since their main land border is with Russia, which is also a diminishing population country, there's not a manpower competition there. There is a bit of a manpower competition with India, but of course their direct border is very small, and it's not a matter of who can put more people there. But China's position versus India is definitely going to be affected. India, as you know, is going to pass China in overall population before mid-century. And there's this competition of models. You know, will we have a authoritarian China emerge as the more powerful country in the second half of this century, or will it be democratic India? India is betting more on innovation and a service-led economy. China is trying to make that adjustment, but has remained a heavily manufacturing, low-cost, labor-dominated economy. Both India and China face this issue of a large gap between the number of surviving male children and surviving female children. And a number of people have commented that, oh my God, you're going to have so many frustrated young men who can't find wives. They're going to become free-floating samurai-type warriors for hire, or marauding gangs, or create other kinds of trouble. I am not pessimistic on that score. I kind of differ from that, and that's because one of my other hats, I'm a world historian, and it turns out if you look at the long-term history of both China and India, this differential sex selection survival is not something new. It's true they didn't have ultrasound, but in both China and India, infant mortality was not considered something intolerable and morally outrageous. In fact, the rates of infant mortality were high enough that both cultures tended not to treat a person as alive from the moment of conception or even birth, but not until they survived their first year were they considered fully members of society. So the selective infanticide of young women, either directly by abandonment or indirectly by malnutrition, and whenever times were tough, families would preferentially conserve calories for their young boy children, not for young women. So more young boys tended to survive even hundreds of years ago. We have 19th century genealogies from China that show a surplus of men. So a surplus of men. So how is this handled? It was not considered a great shame or burden not to have a wife if you were a poorer or younger child. There was a general tendency, both in India through the caste system and in China, for hypergamy. That is, women would try and marry up. If you were from a lower caste or if you were a poor woman, your goal was to try and marry someone who had somewhat higher status. The result was there was always a kind of left-behind portion of bachelors, and they sought their fortune abroad. The reason there's so many Chinese and Indian merchants today in Africa, South Asia, all across Southeast Asia, is because China and India have been sending their unmarried young men abroad in search of trade and work and wives for a long time. So if this problem were to grow without end, if you had a huge, 30, 40, 50% imbalance, you could scare me. But we saw this problem in Korea, and the Koreans basically have returned to a natural male-female gender balance, partly as a consequence of social criticism of the practice and establishing women's rights, but partially also because the difference in value between a male and female child has shrunk. Under modern social conditions, with women getting educated and women working, there's not any longer a huge cost to women as opposed to gain from men. I imagine that China and India will follow that same trajectory, and that the extreme practice of sex selection will taper off. And in the meantime, those countries will deal with it the way they've always dealt with it historically. So I think that will be okay. I think the real question looking at Chinese and Indian demography for the future is that China is facing a rapid slowdown and loss of growth in the youth portion of its population. That's going to affect its economy, its innovativeness. It's facing increasing demands from an aged population. Is that going to be a government responsibility? Is that going to be a responsibility of the younger generation? We don't know. They've never had it before. And how is that going to affect their competition with India, which will be younger and continue growing for another few decades beyond China?
Question in the back, and then over there.
James Sang, you used the phrase "get the right data." I was wondering, for the amateurs, does the book in fact give us some guidance as to who has good data and who has bad data? And related question, how does the field handle uncertainties in its forecasts? You indicated, for example, that there's somebody who says that there'll be 750 million Nigerians by the end of end of this century. How do people put in error brackets for their forecasts? Or is it up to the reader to find out that people disagree?
Very good question. I'm going to start on that, and then I'll ask for help from my esteemed colleagues here. The book gives you, well, let's put it this way. Whenever any of the authors refers to their data, it's always carefully sourced, and you'll find that most of us rely on the United Nations Population Division for global population data. On the other hand, I think Eurostat, the European Union Statistical Division, is more reliable for European demography and often has more detail. And the United Nations, I think, is coming in for some criticism now. They changed their method of forecasting future global population. And I'll try and sum that up as best I can. They used to work by looking at the age structure and history and trends of a given country. So if you have a country like Ethiopia, they'd say, what has been the change in women's childbearing habits and change in life expectancy over the last 20 years? And if we expect those trends to continue, what would that do to life expectancy and childbearing in the future? And are there any reasons to expect those future trends to change? And the UN would assemble a range of different scenarios. They'd have a constant fertility scenario. Let's say nothing changes from today. We just project that forward. They'd have a high scenario where they say, let's assume that life expectancy grows more rapidly than it has in the past, and that fertility doesn't fall as fast. And they'd have a low scenario where they say, let's assume life expectancy has kind of leveled out or will only grow slowly, and let's assume that fertility falls rapidly. So the United Nations would offer several different trajectories based on different assumptions, each of which reflects a different view of how much of the past is liable to continue, how much is liable to change. Now this year, the United Nations modified its method a little bit. They said, we can do better than that. We don't just have to look at the data on Ethiopia when trying to figure out what will happen in Ethiopia. we can look at the data on neighboring countries in the region and get more information. Because after all, one thing we know historically is that regionally countries do tend to move somewhat similarly with regard to population. But what this means is that for a country like Nigeria, the demographic trends in more sparsely populated nearby countries have been factored into the projection for Nigeria. So a country like Niger and Mali that are less densely populated and still very rapidly growing, some of their growth now affects the projection for the United Nations different variants for Nigeria. This is how they got the sudden change of projecting Nigeria from 450 to 750 million by 2100. Now, because of this range, it means that the consumer of population forecasts needs to think for themselves. The U.S. Census Bureau also issues global population forecasts. They use the older methodology, so I would go back and kind of compare now the U.S. Census and the world and the United Nations views. If the United Nations projections look extreme in some countries, you might temper that by saying, oh, they changed their methods. Let's see what the U.S. Census Bureau projections are. That said, what I can tell you about population forecasts is they tend to be much better than economic forecasts, but that's not saying much. Let me see what our other experts would like to add to that.
Is it on?
No, yeah. You don't have to touch
Okay. I will actually make a plug for you to stick around and listen to all of our presentations, because I'll be speaking a little bit specifically on the issue of population projections. I am not nearly as much of an expert on the methodology of the UN's techniques as Jack is, and there's also someone else in the audience that I can point you to if you have really in-depth methodological questions. One thing I would say is that when you are working with the UN projections, which are the sort of gold standard for international time series and cross-sectional data, it's very interesting to consider their constant fertility variant, which Jack mentioned. The most commonly cited variant is the medium variant. That's the one that produces the result we've all heard, that population will reach 9 billion across the world by 2050. And that's based on some complex assumptions. I'll touch a little bit more on those later. The constant fertility variant assumes what will happen if fertility rates stay completely unchanged. And correct me if I'm wrong, I think it may actually assume continued improvements in life expectancy. So it's really just about fertility staying unchanged. And in that case, Nigeria would reach 500 million by 2050. So as far as I know, that particular that scenario does not take into account what's happening in neighboring countries or some of the questions we may have about those assumptions. That's purely looking at status quo. We reach, 500 million, half a billion people in that country in 2050. So the constant fertility variant is not necessarily realistic in many, if not most cases, but it's a very good tool for us to consider what will happen if we stay where we are.
Is the data presented as span charts? How are you presenting
The United Nations makes all the data available online. So if you go to the UN World Population Prospects webpage, you can easily find either total population or various detailed age distributions and other data. It really pops up at the touch of a finger. It's very nice. They don't present the graphics there. They do have a World Population Report summary that does present graphics, those lines going up at different rates. But I actually encourage anyone who's at all interested to look up particular countries and particular estimates, because that's really the only way you get a good sense of the variation. Now, I also want to say, Liz mentioned the constant fertility variant. I actually like using the constant fertility variant for European countries because the UN actually assumes a reversion to the mean. They believe that fertility in those European countries like Italy and Germany and Spain that's the lowest, they say, well, it can't stay that low, it's going to come back up. But I'm not persuaded, and I haven't seen many studies that argue that this is necessarily going to happen. In fact, given the economic decline and stagnation we're seeing in Europe, that's likely to have a further depressive effect. In fact, in the United States, there was a bit of a sign of recovery in births early in the 2000s, but since 2007, U.S. births have fallen quite significantly. So some of these kind of little refinements are European countries that have below replacement fertility. Are they going to revert to replacement fertility or not? For some countries, that would be a quite large increase in fertility. If you have a country that's fertility rate is 1.5, as a few European countries have, to get back to 2, you're talking about a 33% increase in the fertility rate. It's not that easy to see that coming. So your question is actually a very profound one, because different populations heading in different directions. Is life expectancy growing rapidly? Is fertility falling? How far is it falling? Kind of where a country is in its demographic trajectory is often going to affect what are the most reasonable assumptions for where it's going to be in the future. I often can surprise people by saying, my kids, I've got one born in 92, one born in 96. I actually expect my kids will be here in 2100 to see how those projections work, because life expectancy has actually been growing at a very steady rate, adding a year or so every decade. And life expectancy now is over 80. 100 years from now, there's no reason not to expect average life expectancy in developed nations to hit the century mark. At least there's nothing in the data that tells us that this is not going to happen. So I think there's a lot of interesting work to be done in figuring out what are the tweaks.
Okay, we had a couple more. One in the back and one over here.
We have three more.
Okay,
Several.
good. Get those, Jeff, too.
Good afternoon. Maureen Lynch. And you mentioned specifically the issue or debate about dual nationality, dual citizenship. So I'd be curious to what extent the book covers the flip side of that, or the 12 million stateless around the world, and particular large pockets, whether Bangladesh, Syria, Kuwait, so on. Thank you.
Yeah. We don't have a chapter on statelessness per se, but we have a number of chapters that examine the issue of national identity and citizenship in Europe and in Africa, from the question of how is it decided who becomes a full member of society in a society that historically has multiple divisions, whether religious, ethnic. As you know, Ivory Coast, the question of could the presidential candidates run or not. That's the kind of issue that does come up in the chapters on politics and identity in the book. Anyone want to add anything? Or?
No, I won't add anything to that. We don't specifically look at statelessness, but it is a fascinating area. It's interesting that sometimes stateless peoples will gravitate to religious identities that are stateless, if you like. So global, Islamism in some of the refugee camps in Lebanon. It's quite an interesting phenomenon, but I mean, it's not something that we deal with directly. No.
Eric, question over here, and then Jeff in the middle.
Sarah Flam. My question is regarding the political trends we're seeing throughout the world in relation to the demographic change. It seems to me that logical responses to the youth bulb and population growth would be typical liberal policies. Government providing more jobs, educate youth so they can be more productive, ease migration restrictions or expand them so that people can migrate between countries more. So how can you explain? But increasingly, it seems, at least in the Western world, that governments are becoming more conservative in Western Europe, in the United States. I guess in the Middle East, they're liberalizing. So how can you reconcile this difference, and when do you think maybe they'll converge more?
Well, one of the chapters in the book, I'm going to put a plug in for one of our authors who's not here today. Richard Sincata looks very closely at trends in democracy and trends in demographic transition. And he finds countries that are further along the demographic transition tend to be more hospitable toward consolidating democracy. But He also worries that countries that are shifting back and becoming older, kind of this, what they call the fifth stage of the demographic transition, when you're doing rapid aging, that they may shift to the right. He worries about this conservative backlash, and he points to Hungary. He's talked to me about as a place where, hey, you're seeing identity issues, generational conflict issues, and people's desire for kind of an imposition of order to solve this. Russia's another country that seems to be going through this demographic stress and not emerging as one would hope. The interesting question for all these countries is in a generational conflict. If you have simply lived with an economic model that always assumes 2 or 3% economic growth based on 1 or 2% population growth, so that younger generations will always be a little bit larger and a little bit richer than the generations that came before them, then you don't really have a problem financing health care or pensions. But if you run into this problem now of older generations being maybe both older and larger and even wealthier because of restricted economic opportunities or bad timing for the youth cohort, then you have this serious problem between an older generation that wants to hold on to what it's had and what it feels it's earned, and a younger generation that is frustrated and feels the system is rigged against them. And under those circumstances, we're seeing this very strong conservative type of backlash, and I think there's a good risk we'll see more of that in years to come.
Yeah, just to add something to that, there's this issue of if you're talking about immigration restriction sentiment in Europe in particular, I mean, we should remember that the period of liberalization is actually relatively short, and that Europe, I mean, especially if you go back in European history, I mean, there's not a long history of immigration in most countries, with France being a partial exception. So it's really looking at the sort of post-1950s period. It's up until perhaps the 80s, I think, can be seen as somewhat of an exception. And then from about the mid to late 80s, you start to get a substantial rise in far-right voting across many European countries. And I really think that if you were to look at the electorates, they would be moving in a restrictionist direction in the future. So it's the governments are campaigning, who can lower numbers. That is really the campaign direction.
There's a nice historical article in the book by Brian Grattan on the history of the immigration politics debate in the United States. Recommend it.
Okay, Jeff?
Jeff Golgan at American University. Jack, you're also an expert on political revolutions, and since you mentioned Mao's rapid population growth policy that was then later changed quite dramatically in China, it also struck me that under Khomeini there was a very similar trend in Iran, where there was a very rapid population growth followed by a rapid deceleration. So is N of 2 a general trend here, or is there anything that we can say about how revolutions affect demography? And I'm, of course, particularly interested in light of what's going on in the Arab Spring.
Yeah. I think what we have generally seen, as you point out, I mean, first of all, if there's a large internal conflict and a civil war, as often occurs in revolutions, the immediate impact is, of course, a culling of young men for military casualties. But the question of policy is interesting. What we see in revolutionary regimes is generally a centralization of government and therefore the ability to impose a strong policy. And so if the government, after a revolution, wants to impose a pro-growth or pro-natalist policy, you often will get this kind of rapid increase. And yet if they decide, we have to improve ourselves economically, we have to improve our capital ratio and education level, and we have to reduce fertility, revolutionary governments have been capable of doing that as well. They retain the centralized control. I don't think there's a general rule that revolutionary leaders tend to prefer more or fewer people. I think they make a calculation of what's in their economic interest and act accordingly. It's really the centralized power that makes a difference. Fortunately, and this is what reassures me, centralized authority is not the only way to have an effective fertility reduction program. That we've seen voluntary programs work in Indonesia, for example, and in Brazil and so on, but it still requires strong government action to both overcome cultural barriers, to make sure that knowledge about contraception and availability of contraceptives reaches rural areas in order for this to take effect. So I'd say one of the lessons of the two cases you point out is that strong government definitely can help reshape demographic behavior.
Okay, am I missing one back there? Okay, it's hard.
John in the back, too.
Okay.
Hi, Peter Stute, Concordia University, Montreal. I had a question about if you're able to integrate epidemiology with your demographic studies. And I was thinking in particular about HIV, AIDS rates, and shifts there that have taken place in Africa, but also growing rates in some areas. Are you able to put that into your calculus, and in terms of how that affects the actual politics, I suppose, of these states?
Yeah. Well, there are two issues there. One is how HIV and other epidemics affect the overall population of a country, and second are specific political issues. Somewhat surprisingly, the HIV epidemics have not greatly impacted population growth rates, even in countries with epidemics. And that's because even those who contract HIV generally do not lose the majority of their reproductive years. So they remain reproductively active before they sicken and die. So that has meant that even countries with relatively high rates of HIV infection have not had a sharp reduction in what had been their anticipated birth rate or population growth rate. Now, a bigger problem is the selective decimation of urban professionals where HIV infection rates had been very high. And there was a lot of concern that this would hollow out the capacity of governments suffering from HIV. That also has not really happened. That's partly because one of the countries that was most affected by this was Botswana, which is an unusually cohesive and well-run country, and partly because the administration of the HIV cocktails has reduced the fatality rate, particularly among those individuals who are the more educated professional groups who are best able to stick with the regimen and have access to the medications. So the short answer is we've looked at the impact of HIV and other epidemics. They haven't, in and of themselves, had the demographic or political effects that some people have been worried about as being the real threats. Anything to add, Elizabeth?
Just that the UN Population Division, in its suite of population projections, does produce a few variants that are related to different assumptions about HIV. So, for example, you could see what a country's population would look like if there was a zero prevalence rate.
I know we had another couple of questions in the back, so let's continue.
There's a question in the back. Sorry, just a little coordination.
Frank Kennefick, Beacon Technology. Previously with the U.S. military, Foreign Service, World Bank, in the last 10 years, an independent consultant, involved a lot in remote areas where demographics is critical in my belief, and I'm delighted to see you folks are finally getting it out of the rain barrel. Question. The political dimensions of demographic information and implications. Do you folks in the book, or can you comment on the seeming almost complete disconnect between military and political leaders, at least in this country, on the demographic factors in countries where we're operating, but more specifically the subset of what I call the real driver of conflict or non-conflict, which is the local's perception or the actual incidence of per capita well-being. Thank you.
Sorry, did you want to say?
Go ahead.
No. I mean, I think I picked up your point, which was quite interesting. The idea that where you have simply the idea that rapid population growth leading to a surplus population is simply more likely to translate into death and suffering. And I think that's, I think that is largely accurate when you don't have the kind of strong, capable states and economic growth that you need. And it is one of those, to us, quite obvious factors that policymakers should be paying a lot more attention to, that actually this can make a big difference. And so I think I would agree with you very much there, yeah.
I'd say we don't talk about the differential perceptions of military and political leaders on this, but we insist that the presence of large youth cohorts and lack of opportunity, low income, and weak government is a dangerously explosive situation, and this is something policymakers should try and avert. And if that helps the military with their arguments about how to prevent wars, all the better. But my experience complements yours that commanders on the ground are much more acutely aware of local perceptions than politicians based in capitals.
I would also add that in several years of working this issue on the policy side in Washington, I think there's been growing acknowledgement of the youth bulge and related demographic issues among both the military and the civilian leadership. Our most recent Secretary of Defense made several comments related to this. The current Secretary of State has. What I think the challenge is that all policymakers tend naturally to focus on their own country and on the other countries with which they typically operate. And so in this case, I think our security establishment remains very interested in the demographic issues facing our allies. Of course, as the nature of conflict has changed over the past decade or so, they have become more and more interested in the demographics of so-called failing states. We've seen through the establishment of the Africa Command some growing cognizance of regions that historically have not been of great strategic interest becoming more so. But I also think that that's a mindset that is slow to change.
I continue to see questions, but I also want to give you a break, and so have opportunity.
Let's go to 1:30 at least.
Okay. Well, why don't we collect the remaining ones we have, and then Jack can answer them together. We have John back there. We have one up here in the front in the alcove. Are there any others in the middle? Okay. Why don't we take those three and then.
Jack, I've got a quick question. This is very interesting. I was reminded that. As I, like my colleague on my left here, have been around for a long time, the youth bulge is not a new issue. It was a great focus of the John Kennedy administration, led by his brother, with all sorts of things being done about it in one way or another. But my question is this. Many of the success stories, both in terms of demographic indicators and growth indicators, have done well because they ended up with competent governments, not necessarily democratic. Is anywhere in the book an exploration of how the issues are related to having competent governments to deal with them? Because issues like female education, health indicators, they all require, by and large, a government with some degree of competency and interest in the issues. And is that anywhere in the book? That's my question.
Okay, Sean, if you could pass the microphone over there, and then Sandeep, the last one is up here in the front.
Oh, me?
Yep, please.
Thanks. I'm Steve Crabtree from Gallup. This is kind of a weird question, but I was reading about the massive decline in fertility rates in Latin America. I think it was an article in the Post from a couple of months ago, but they named several factors, including, the usual suspects, urbanization and healthcare and things like that. But they also talked about the massive popularity of soap operas in Latin America, and said that there was all this pressure to have upward mobility because these soap operas depict these glamorous, wealthy families with few children. I didn't know how much credence to give that, and if that's indeed a huge factor, what does that say about the role of media in demographic change?
Okay, and then the final question over here.
Ghazi Aslam, and I work. I'm right now working at the World Bank. Dr. Goldstone, you were familiar with the report that the Social Development Department of the World Bank was working on, and one of the things was looking at how generational and gender relationships and some of the demographic changes affect the ability of the society to cope with fragility. And one of the things while working at the report that we came across was that youth is not always defined by age. It's really, there are other things like being able to get married or have economic independence that define your adulthood. It's very difficult to capture from the data, but how would your results change, or do you have any any discussion of that issue?
Okay, all good, straightforward questions. John, the answer is yes. The book constantly talks about the interaction between population and quality of governance because it is a focus on political demography. The idea of the youth bulge has been around a long time. Concern about aging and Social Security has been around a long time. But what we have found is that these tend to be specialist concerns. For most people who are in the legal profession, pursuing policy careers, or conventional political scientists, they view demography as an arcane specialty for people who want to work in the census. They don't see it as crucial to their concerns. And one of the reasons we put this book together was to try and show people how many ways demography is crucial to things that do interest you: national politics, international security, ethnic conflict. So it's all about those issues. Now, in regard to soap operas and fertility, absolutely it's crucial. It sounds a bit odd, but culture is a very powerful factor shaping people's concept of what's an ideal family, and people tend to choose contraceptive and marriage and childbearing behavior to fit their concept. So if the concept of an ideal family and a virtuous woman is a woman who gives and raises lots of children, stays home, takes care of things, then that's going to be enforced on that society and enforced on a lot of that women. But if you have an alternate cultural view that says a virtuous woman is one who's strong and capable and educated and independent and spends time outside the home, it's a different model, but that model also requires fewer children. And that's what you get as people adopt that model, and it's been a major factor. Now, that also raises the question of, is there a similar cultural definition of what it means to be a youth or what it means to be a child? And again, it's very much the case that people conform to what their culture tells them, this is what you should be doing. And so in some cultures, if you're not married by the time you're 25 or 26, you have not become a responsible adult. And it's an anger and a frustration that you don't have the opportunity to do that. So we can pick that up in the data by looking at age distribution, marriage distribution, can also people that are in the formal versus informal sector. People who are in the informal sector don't have access to the same capital and opportunities that people in the formal sector of the economy do. So we're looking at all of these issues of when a population is changing, growing, becoming more diverse, becoming more urban, how are the people moving through their life course? Are they having fewer children? Are they getting married earlier or later? Are they entering the labor market earlier or later in greater numbers? All of these things matter. For example, one of the responses to Europe's problem of older workers would also be to have more women in labor force participation, because in some countries, particularly in Southern and Eastern Europe, it's still relatively low compared to Northern Europe. So it's not all necessarily immigration. It could just be making better use of the resources you have. So we worry about all of these, what we call kind of life course decisions, and how they feed into making a community work.
Terrific. Well, thank you for some excellent questions, and thank you, Jack, for the breadth and the ability to answer across. You actually must have read these chapters pretty closely. So I propose that we do this, an opportunity, as Jack said. Now we even know more special opportunity to grab this book while you can. To do that, also, if you'd like another brownie, another cookie, and a drink, pick that up. But let's not make it a long break, but take advantage of a time that we'll reshuffle up front and convene back here in say 10 minutes tops.
Give him 15.
Okay, Jack's generous. We'll give him 15.